does not need you to say, I love you. The government wants to know that you can solve their problems.
China is building its own internet focused on very different values, and it's now exporting their vision of the internet to other countries. So this is one of the reasons why we don't operate Facebook, Instagram, or our other services in China.
The Communist Party in China decides that they want a global champion. It can happen. We know that.
The answer is the Chinese government stealing technology. That's the thing I've read reports but don't have personal experience with.
Now, China is the leading producer of steel, manufactured 1 billion tons of steel last year as the construction industry boomed.
To weigh in, if you could, on what we're seeing happening in China this morning.
The Communist Party in China is increasing its grip.
Chinese economy in 2021.
China has had an active role in assembly, processing, manufacturing, and high-tech products that are then sold across the globe.
Is resulting in more business going between China and Europe.
That China has laid out.
We need to be big because we need to be able to compete with China.
For many decades, the USA has been the world's largest economy with an annual GDP of $20 billion or greater. However, in recent years, China managed to get close to these figures and even threatens to surpass them in the near future. What led to this sudden explosion of the Chinese economy were numerous thriving domestic industries, some of which are now among the largest in the world. In this video, we'll go over 12 industries where China is leading and discover how they managed to rise to the top. Number 1. Aluminum. In recent years, the Chinese aluminum industry is in rapid development. In fact, China's share in the global production of this metal rose from 40.9% in 2010 to a record high of 57.2% in 2020. And although its aluminum export is in steady decline, this country shows no signs of stopping since domestic use is on the rise. However, there's a dark side to this industry. Namely, in order to produce such high amounts of aluminum, China had to use more than 500 terawatt-hours of electricity, most of which comes from coal power plants. This means that China's aluminum industry alone is responsible for more carbon dioxide pollution than the whole country of Indonesia. Furthermore, its dependence on coal makes this industry susceptible to shortages and thus very volatile. However, considering China's tendency to put ecology second, as well as its position as the #1 coal producer, it's not very likely we'll see its aluminum sector fail anytime soon. Number 2. Steel. When we talk about steel production, no country comes close to China. In fact, with over 80 million tons of steel a month, China's share in the global steel market is well over 50%. And even though domestic and world demand for this good is sharply reduced, steel mills remain one of the driving factors of the country's economic growth. However, the new measures that the Chinese government is planning to impose might shake up the steel industry in the future. Namely, steel production accounts for 10 to 20% of the carbon emissions of this country, so it's only natural that Beijing wants to reduce steel production to a bare minimum. And yet, this task will be impossible as long as steel companies continue exporting their goods all over the world, which is why the government is considering export tariffs. So the glory days of the Chinese steel empire might be behind it. Still, no country will ever be able to compete with the People's Republic in this industry. Number 3. Auto industry. Once again, China might not be the first country that crosses your mind when you think about automobiles. However, in the last decade, China has managed to overcome the automotive industry giants Germany and Japan and climb its way to the top. Today, this country produces over 21 million units a year, which is more than the next 4 countries combined. Now, you might be wondering where all these cars are sold and why haven't you seen any of them on the road? Well, first of all, the Chinese market is enormous, with around 400 million licensed drivers. So, brands such as SAIC, Changan, BYD, and Geely are made primarily for domestic use, with export accounting for only about 5% of all the vehicles. Secondly, some world-renowned car brands have partially or fully moved their manufacturing process to China. Big names such as Volkswagen, General Motors, Ford, Renault, BMW, Honda, and Mitsubishi all have their joint ventures in this country, which further enlarges the auto industry. Number 4. Farming. With 1.4 billion citizens, China is the most populated country in the world. So it isn't that surprising to find out it has a more than well-developed farming industry. Still, you might be shocked to learn that this country managed to turn into such a farming superpower with less than 10% of its total area being arable. The main way Chinese agriculture has become so successful during recent years is through organizational and technological improvements. During the entire 20th century, China was plagued by famine after famine as it struggled to produce enough food for everyone. Nowadays, this country is not only self-sufficient, but also able to export its products around the world. And as of 2018, China is the world's largest producer of rice, wheat, potato, tomatoes, pickles, apples, onions, garlic, and many other agricultural goods. Additionally, most tea lovers have China to thank for their hot beverage, as it produces more than 2 million tons of tea a year. Number 5. E-commerce. With companies such as Amazon and eBay, the USA may seem like the obvious pick for the largest e-commerce industry. However, this title belongs to China, with an estimated $672 billion in online sales each year. These figures are even more impressive when we compare them to the USA's $340 billion in e-sales. And yet, it's only recently that China developed such a huge e-commerce industry. The company that led this development, Alibaba Group, is now one of the world's biggest online commerce businesses. With e-commerce sites such as AliExpress, Alibaba.com, Taobao, and Tmall under its wing, Alibaba Group managed to achieve a net income of almost $150 billion in 2020. Furthermore, in just the first quarter of 2021, Alibaba exceeded those numbers, so it might even be able to quadruple them by the end of the year. All in all, China's e-commerce sector seems to be headed for a bright future. Number 6. Textile. 3 words you can find on almost every piece of clothing out there are "made in China." And this is far from a coincidence, as more than 50% of textile output comes exactly from this country. Moreover, China is the biggest exporter of apparel, with an export value that reached $54 billion in 2020. Now, you might be wondering, how did China become such a textile giant? After all, it doesn't even have any famous clothing brands. And while this assessment might be correct, what made the Chinese textile industry so powerful is not the domestic production, but outsourced manufacturing. Namely, most major fashion players have outsourced their manufacturing process to this country because of its cheap labor force and lack of ecological and legal restrictions. World-renowned clothing labels such as Nike, Adidas, H&M, Pandora, and Gap all have dozens of factories in China. However, the standard of living in this country is steadily improving. Plus, Beijing is slowly introducing measures against labor exploitation and environmental degradation. So we could soon see many fashion brands leave. But even if that happens, China will remain the biggest textile producer in the world for the foreseeable future. Number 7. Tobacco. Once upon a time, America was famous for its tobacco production and processing. What's more, companies such as Lorillard Tobacco are older than the nation itself. However, those days are long gone, as China, Brazil, and India all surpass the USA in this industry. What's especially interesting about China's tobacco sector is that it's run under the umbrella of a single company. China National Tobacco Corporation is a state-owned manufacturer of tobacco products that enjoys an absolute monopoly in this country. And considering China accounts for roughly 40% of the world's total cigarette consumption, CNTC has a perfect market position. We should note that it's hard to find any Chinese cigarettes on a foreign market, and vice versa. CNTC exports only a small portion of its products, mostly to surrounding countries. On the other hand, even if you find a pack of foreign brand cigarettes in China, it would be made locally under a licensing deal. Number 8. Toys. For several decades, China has been dominating the toy industry with a global market share of around 80%. In other words, 4 out of 5 toys on the world market are made in this country. And although outsourced manufacturing makes up for a large percent of all the products, the huge majority of toys are produced by domestic companies. So even if all the international manufacturers were to leave China, it would remain the leading toy industry in the world. In addition, several important factors might further solidify this position. First of all, thanks to the improved standard of living, Chinese citizens can spend more money on toys and games. Secondly, Beijing relaxed its one-child policy in 2013, which means the market for these products is now increasing even more rapidly. Finally, new sales channels in the form of online stores are making toys more accessible and affordable than ever before. Number 9. Consumer electronics. Another group of manufactured goods China is famous for are consumer electronics. From smartphones and laptops to headphones and other gadgets, there's nothing Chinese manufacturers can't produce. The electronics industry in this country is a mixture of domestic manufacturers and international companies that outsource their production processes. Together, these two groups account for over 40% of the global electronics exports, which makes China the leader in this industry. In recent years, there's been a significant shift within the Chinese electronics sector. Namely, domestic consumer electronics companies such as Huawei, Lenovo, and Xiaomi are slowly expanding and taking over both the domestic and international markets. And although these brands do not enjoy the best reputation around the world, they have improved to the point where they can compete with the likes of Samsung, Apple, and HP. Number 10. Beer. Although Germany or Czechoslovakia are the first countries that come to mind when we talk about this drink, China is by far the biggest beer producer in the world. And this comes as no surprise when we consider the dramatic increase in beer consumption in this country. According to the World Health Organization, the average Chinese citizen went from drinking half a bottle of beer a year in 1961 to 103 bottles in 2007. Combined, all Chinese beer companies produce around 50 million tons of this golden liquid a year. Compare that to 22 million tons the USA makes, and you can see how superior China actually is in this industry. However, these numbers become far less impressive when we consider production per person. Namely, China manufactures roughly 9,000 gallons of beer per person, while the US does almost double that amount. Number 11. Coal. As we've mentioned, China is also the leading coal producer, and with a considerable margin. Namely, with 4 billion tons of coal a year, it accounts for over 50% of coal production worldwide. In addition, many years ago, China even had the Ministry of Coal Industry, and although this ministry was abolished in 1998, coal mining is anything but dying down. However, China is also the largest coal consumer in the world thanks to more than 1,000 coal power plants in the country. And although the share of coal in this energy mix declined from 80% to 58% in previous years, it remains the primary source of electricity. This fact is alarming considering how damaging coal-fired power stations are to the environment. Still, Beijing is unable to clamp down on coal production as this move would put millions of people out of work. Number 12. Meat. Over the last decades, the Chinese meat industry expanded so drastically that it's now the biggest one in the world. In fact, this country produced more than 77.5 million metric tons of meat in 2020, which puts it at a comfortable lead over the USA. However, aside from being the #1 meat producer, China is also the #1 meat consumer and importer. In other words, even with its astonishing current production volume, this industry isn't able to meet the needs of domestic consumers. In addition, the recent outbreaks of African swine fever killed around 60% of hog herds in China, which further boosted pork import to this country. All things considered, the Chinese meat industry will probably remain on top and continue growing as long as there is a strong domestic demand. Those were the 12 industries where China is leading the global race. As it continues on its path of industrial and economic development, more and more sectors will be joining this list. However, decades might pass before the Chinese economy manages to surpass that of the USA. Still, it's interesting to explore the areas where this country excels and learn from their experience.